and welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host, and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. Today's guest is Grace Lindo, an attorney at law and a partner at Nunez Schofield de Leon and Company, one of the largest law firms in Jamaica. In this episode, we will be discussing privacy with a particular focus on personal data held by the state. Over the past few years, and especially after the terrorist attacks in the US on September 11, 2001, greater emphasis has been placed on national security, with very broad powers being given to the responsible agencies, including to collect even more personal data such as biodata on individuals. But an important question that we perhaps need to ask as the world becomes ever more digital is, can a balance be found between increasing security concerns and an individual's right to privacy? Enjoy. Grace, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Michelle.
Okay, so Grace, I guess before we really focus in on the balance that can be found between increasing security concerns and an individual's right to privacy, can you just give us a sense as to what is happening with privacy worldwide, or with respect to maybe particular trends that you're seeing in the region based on your exposure as an attorney?
Well, privacy has become a very hot topic in 2018. One, I think because of GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, out of the European Union earlier this year. And it has also become a hot topic because we have seen several breaches. We have seen persons becoming more cognizant of their privacy rights in respect of their digital data and their digital identities. So there is this heightened global awareness of privacy, not only privacy of the self and what happens in your home and in your backyard, but also privacy online, because we now spend so much time online. In the Caribbean, I would say our concerns regarding privacy have been triggered again by GDPR and by trying to become compliant with the European Union, because we recognize that the European Union is a big trading partner for us. But also coming back home here in Jamaica, because we are seeking to implement certain, whether it's surveillance, regulations, or we're seeking to implement what is called the national ID system, which is going to turn our ID system, which we don't have now. So really creating an ID system, which is for the large part digital. And people are now concerned about their protection of self beyond what is occurring in day-to-day life. And it's becoming a quite live issue.
So just pointing to one aspect of the issues you raised, for example, with respect to the national ID system that Jamaica intends to implement, and on the basis of, I guess, national security, you find that many countries worldwide are now collecting biodata, especially fingerprints of individuals. As it relates to privacy, and specifically an individual's right to privacy, should we be concerned about biodata being collected, or the breadth and depth of the personal information that the state is trying to collect on its citizens?
We should be concerned because general trends now in the data privacy world and data protection world is to collect the minimum amount of data necessary. And why is that? It's because when you have a breach, when you have someone that hacks into your system, if you do have the minimum amount of data, then there is less of a risk to the individual, because then the person won't have gotten a full profile of the individual. So the trend now is towards having minimization. It's called the data minimization principle. And there's also a trend to having less retention of data, meaning you only keep the data for as long as you need it. Now, the concern which we have about these new biometric forms of data collection and leading to digital identities is that there's such a general purpose for this data that, one, it requires a wide collection or wide scope. So it requires quite a bit, your fingerprints, in some instances, iris scans, if necessary. It requires quite a bit of biometric data, and there's no limitation on how it is used or for how long it will be kept. And that goes against the trends that we're seeing internationally. And I think that's what's leading to some of the concern we are seeing on the ground.
So, for example, looking here in Jamaica, again, speaking about the national identification system, the act was passed that is supposed to facilitate its implementation. And granted that there would have been, considerable debate about the biodata that the act was stipulated be collected. And as you rightfully said, fingerprints as well as iris scans in some instances. Now that the law has been passed and there's active work towards implementing it, what is the feeling on the ground about NIDS from the perspective now that is the government to some respect trying to downplay the extent to which it intends to collect the biodata, or are people just becoming more resigned to the fact that it's going to be inevitable?
That's a funny question. I would have to rely on really anecdotal evidence and what I've seen on social media. I know when NIDS was passed, there is a huge group which feels, well, a significant group, I would say, not huge, but significant enough group, which feels that it is necessary to enable the government to carry out certain objectives, anti-corruption, for instance, and to digitize several government services and obligations, and to make sure that we have enough cross-referencing. So there's that group that's convinced. And to a large extent, I feel that the techies too, the persons who are technically minded, are convinced that this is partly the way to go. But there are always going to be technological skeptics, people who are skeptical about anything which is new and invasive such as this. So we had that grouping before. I suspect too, after the case was fully ventilated before the courts, the Constitutional Court last week, I believe more people are becoming aware of the constitutional impact, that perhaps some questions were not answered in the bill itself, in the law itself. And so there's a mixed bag. Slowly but surely, I do think that people are beginning to question whether this was the right route or whether the route was properly defined. And I'm hopeful that Jamaicans are keeping a keen interest, because it is something which could affect us for a very long time.
Absolutely. So what was the case what was the basis of the case that went before the Constitutional Court?
So it just so happens that, and I need to give this preamble, it just so happens that in 2011, we amended our constitution somewhat to make it more granular. And so there are several rights which were not enshrined in our constitution, which became enshrined, and one such is the right to privacy, which was really just a footnote beforehand. But other things were enshrined, such as the right to an education and the right to a passport. The latter one is one that actually has been raised in its case. And with our rights becoming more granular, what has happened is that you're seeing more, especially in this case, you're seeing the use of some constitutional rights, and so you're seeing it being contested in a way that you perhaps have not seen before, certainly in Jamaican courts. And I'm quite interested to see what the courts will decide. But in summary, what the applicants have asked the court, and the applicant being the opposition party or prominent member of the opposition party, what they have asked is for the court to rule that NIDS is unconstitutional insofar as it is required before someone can be issued a passport. And if a law says, your constitution at that says you need, everyone has a right to a passport, their question is, why would you require someone to have a pre-existing form of identification in order to get a document which the country is supposed to give you, your state is supposed to issue to you? So that's one concern. But there are other concerns surrounding the storage of the biometric data. Does it infringe privacy? Will it mean that you will now be able to track individuals because you're retaining all this data, which means you can then survey them and see what they do in the government institutions from time to time? One of the major concerns is the requirement to produce the NIDS, either the card, NID, or rather the NIC, or the number to procure government services. Is that unfair? Is it unfair that Jamaicans will require the card or the number, but foreigners or even people who are of Jamaican heritage do not require it? Public institutions can request and you have to provide the number, but private institutions need not do so. But they can elect to make that a requirement within their own business organizations. So there's lots of questions which arise as to whether this is an intrusion of privacy, whether you're treating me equitably vis-a-vis Jamaicans outside of Jamaica, and whether you are infringing on basic things like me being able to get a passport. And these are valid questions, I believe.
Yes. So is the matter still before the Constitutional Court, or what currently is its status?
So it's before the Constitutional Court because they have reserved their decision in the matter. Both sides in the argument or in the case have presented their arguments rather, and the court, made up of 3 individuals, has reserved their decision, and they should perhaps give that decision in a couple of weeks or months, hopefully in a couple of weeks, because I do think it's an important matter.
Just going back to that whole issue of the storage of biodata, and I it certainly raised some flags for me when you mentioned about the retention of personal data associated with a national identification system, that it's going to be stored for a relatively long time. And you had mentioned about the minimum data retention period. And I guess that does seem to be an area where there's some sort of misalignment there. But just the point of matters related to the actual security and storage of the biodata, I noted that there were some concerns, and I guess certainly those who are opposed to NIDS would have found the India experience earlier this year, where it would appear that their national ID system was hacked. That there were a lot of parallels being drawn to that experience in India and what could possibly happen here in Jamaica. I don't know if you know any more about what
obtained in India.
Yes, what might be some of the issues there.
Well, India has the largest biometric database in the world, Aadhaar, and we're trying to implement something similar. There are nuances there in terms of how it will be implemented, but we're trying to do something similar. And they had a hack earlier this year, and that's always going to be a concern that, the bigger the database is, the more attractive it becomes to hackers. And just, that's just how the world works. Now, in terms of safeguards for us, that's one of the biggest concerns of people in Jamaica, especially people who are in the tech world who understand. Even if they're pro-NIDS, they still, are concerned about how we're going to protect this, because Jamaica is not the richest country in the world. And the data protection regimes rely on what we call a technology neutral principle for safeguarding against hacks. Let me explain. In GDPR, and we have that in our proposed law in Jamaica and several proposed laws in the Caribbean, there is a requirement to put in place technological safeguards which are sufficient for the type of data to be protected. And this is in recognition that, and as a techie you would know, you need to update your security rules and you need to have security updates from time to time because hackers get better every day. And so it is expected that you must have something which is sufficient to the type of data that you are trying to secure. So that's one thing. That being said, though, my residual concern is always going to be our ability to afford that type of security system. And there are other security systems that people have used. I believe in Israel and Mauritius too, and I'll tell you about Mauritius shortly. They have used a card system as opposed to a database per se because of that security concern. In fact, in Mauritius, not the entire fingertip is used or stored on the card because of the recognition that if you put the entire thing on there, there may be an issue. In Estonia, which we champion all the while as a model to follow in Jamaica, my understanding is that they use a decentralized system in which the information, the database, is not stored in one central database, and it's called X-Road, and it is championed to be more secure because of that. Now, I say all of this to say that nowhere in the Jamaican legislation is any such safeguard noted. And the reason why is because typically that sort of nitty-gritty, that sort of minutia would be in regulations. And the regulations were not drafted or put before the court. They have not been presented rather to Parliament. The court can't, give its opinion on regulations which are perhaps in draft state the government, perhaps it appears, was hoping that these regulations would save a bill, but I don't think that can occur. And so the security concerns still exist. I believe that may be one of the downfalls of the bill, that we weren't able to draft something which can within itself show that we gave sufficient thought to security.
Yes. And I did note, though, that on the NIDS website, they do say that they probably are looking to have some sort of decentralized system for storing all of this data. But as you rightfully said, I mean, whether or not you store it all together or in bits and pieces all over the place, all of it needs to be protected. All of it needs to be kept up to date. And as one of my guests said on a recent episode on information security, the hackers tend to be one step ahead of us anyway, or many steps ahead of us anyway. So it is still going to be a challenge, I suspect, to just try to keep all of this information secure, all of this data secure, and have the necessary systems in terms of redundancies, etc., just in case it goes down. So it's still quite disturbing whether ultimately the necessary or as comprehensive a thought as we would hope had been given to the needs of the system.
I mean, I hope so too. I am disappointed in the draft which was put before the Parliament and which was eventually passed, even with 200 and something amendments. We have to be very careful in drafting laws generally, but especially in drafting laws which may have the effect of infringing on people's rights, because within the laws themselves, we need to show that there's a legitimate aim and that there's no other method to achieving this aim other than infringing people's rights. And there's recent learning from it. The Privy Council, in a decision in which it looked at an appeal from the Mauritius court, and Mauritius, like us, still use the Privy Council as their highest court of appeal. The Privy Council looked at a similar ID system and they found that it was constitutional. I believe that Mauritius may have been a step ahead of us because, one, they had regulations. In fact, between one tier of the decision-making process, the court process, and another, i.e. the Privy Council level, they had actually made amendments to their regulations to comply with an early decision. And so they were much further ahead. It also appears that they had a system of ID cards from 1985, and they're really just digitizing it to achieve a greater level of efficiency. But one thing which the court looks at in that decision is whether sensitive data is held on a chip. And the court said no, there were efforts to minimize the sensitive data that was placed on the chip. But the court looked at whether it was reasonably justifiable in a democratic society, which is something that we have to look at too, because that's what our constitution provides. In a democratic society, is it justifiable? Is this the only way to achieve what we want to achieve? And, I am really looking forward to what our local courts will eventually decide. I do think when I look on the justification of the system, I do think we have a serious corruption problem. There are anecdotal stories of people having 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 TRN numbers and people being able to have different identities within our government system, and we'll need to clean that up. The lingering concern, though, is that those issues have arisen because of fleshware and not software.
Fleshware, interesting.
Fleshware, yes. So you know what fleshware is, right? It's a corrupt individual.
Yes.
Who is, it's so that fleshware problem, and it's a Caribbean podcast. I don't want to, badmouth my fellow Jamaicans much more, but that fleshware problem exists. We do have a corruption problem. I mean, there's an independent survey that says so. Transparency International says so. So it's not even me badmouthing my fellow Jamaicans. Yes, we have a corruption problem, and that's a fleshware problem. And that fleshware problem can translate into a needs problem. And I am not sufficiently concerned, I'm not sufficiently convinced, rather, that needs will change our minds overnight to become much more circumspect in how we deal with people's data and how truthful we are and how, not corrupt we are, for want of a better term.
Understood. But let me ask a question, because As you were talking, and I'm surprised I really hadn't thought about it before, in having a national ID, are any of the other pieces of identification that we have now going to be replaced, or is it just going to be something that is added? Because I just checked. I mean, you have driver's license, and I guess that has a picture ID. The tax registration number, which ultimately I guess all adult Jamaicans should have. It doesn't have a picture, but I guess you need it to do a lot of business in Jamaica. You have your voter's ID for all of those who are voting, and that has a image, a photograph of yourself, as well as your passport. So are any of these going to be cancelled or subsumed under the national ID at all?
No, my understanding is that we will have these other forms of identification. That's my understanding. I'm not sure if the NIDS PR grouping has said anything outside of that, because my learning on it comes from the Act, because as a lawyer, that's where I look first. What does the Act say? And generally, the database or the ID card will be used for general ID purposes, so that you can procure government services and other services, that there can be a cross-reference, in other words, and also that it can be used for almost census-related services or census-related activities, that you can know what your population is and plan better and have better data on individuals. So in other words, it is very likely, and I foresee, for instance, we use NIDS instead of a voter ID, and that will cut down on significant sums that we may need to spend on creating these different forms of IDs. But certainly, we're going to have a passport, because it's an international obligation.
Sure, yes.
I think to a driver's license, just because of thinking about it, a driver's license is following a test. It's a different sort of competency. It's not an ID. It's secondary as an ID, but it's really competency to do a particular activity. And so I think we're going to retain quite a bit. But some things I can see the government using it as a backdoor way to say, let's not spend money on various forms of IDs, NIS, those other things.
Yes. Understood. So, although we have focused a lot on Jamaica, but let's probably just try and broaden the discussion a little bit and give me your thoughts on this whole general thrust about national security. As I said again in my introduction, post September 11, I think we all saw the heightened focused on security. So whether or not it's, especially when you travel, and certainly we saw it through the Snowden revelations about some of the things that were happening in the US, and I'm certain it's happening in other countries, maybe even far closer to home than we think. But a lot of things are being done on the basis of national security. And how now do we see, can there be a balance between national security and an individual's right to privacy? Luckily, here in Jamaica, it is now part of the Constitution. For other countries, it may not be quite so clearly defined. However, many countries are signatories to the International Convention on Human Rights, so there may be some basis for their citizens to also seek to use that convention, in defense of those rights.
Right. So agreed. Following 9/11, the Patriot Act has brought many things to us. It has brought called the Proceeds of Crime Act, anti-money laundering, regulations have increased, and surveillance. It's funny because out of the whole Snowden matter too, there has been a recognition within Europe that the bulk collection of data is something to be frowned upon. So it has brought that sphere as well. It hasn't all been, it's a free for all. We must not allow the state to become a part of our lives, and they can infringe at will and without any sanctions. So it's been a mixed bag for, funnily enough, we haven't given all up, although the state has sought to, become intrusive. I actually think the reason why we are seeing, especially for us in the Caribbean, the state becoming more intrusive is because the technology has become cheaper. And so securities are concerned. Yes, national securities are concerned, but it's much more cheaper now for us to have cameras and to have people logging onto our system and to linking their different cameras in, and for us to be having that sort of surveillance. And when technology becomes cheaper, it becomes easier for you, or it becomes more desirable and becomes easier for you to manage. So that's one concern. Now, In relation to this whole Snowden matter too, there is actually case law, as I said, about the massive retention of data in the EU. And that's one area in which the EU has said that, you must not be able to, for some countries certainly, you must not be able to continuously survey your citizens because there is no end that justifies that means. It goes above and beyond what is even justifiable, in a democratic society. Locally, I think we're going to have to start to grapple with that. Unfortunately for us in Jamaica, because of our own security concerns, we, including me myself, are quite compliant with some of these surveillance techniques, about our zones of special operations, for instance. That's another on-the-ground example of how we willingly give in our human rights, our rights, because we recognize that there is a greater good.
Yes.
And, whether that pans out is another thing. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. The government has instituted, for instance, Jamaica Eye. I was at a presentation the other day in which it alarmed me to hear that Jamaica Eye is now monitored by officers at the Jamaica Defence Force. And if Jamaica ever had any inclinations towards military rule, thank God we do not, that would be a huge concern in several other countries.
Just give us give the listeners a brief overview of what Jamaica Eye is, please.
So Jamaica Eye is a program which does not have legislative backing, but involves the government, they say, primarily their cameras being placed in open and public spaces so that they can monitor traffic and other security breaches and possible criminal events. But it also allows private citizens within particular cities to connect and to link in their private cameras, which are public facing, so that Jamaica Eye can have a comprehensive, as much as possible, view of what's happening in the streets. And it's been touted as really one of our crime prevention measures. It does have a lot of potential, but it's one of those things that you have to think in the back of your head. I would love you to, just as you have for NIDS, think about how you would have set out in a law the protections which are available to individuals in spite of having this constant surveillance. Again, it goes back to the current trend in data privacy and data protection. Retention at a minimum. Know how you're processing the data, meaning how is it being used. And with Jamaica Eye, for instance, Jamaica Eye uses image recognition data because, of course, no human can sit down and, peruse that data to come up with an efficient product. It uses image recognition systems and processing system software. Correct. Thank you. And in some jurisdictions, the software has been found to be discriminated to Black people because they're programmed by people who are of a certain hue. These are things we would like to know that have been thought about, and we're not sure that they have been thought about. And so there are always going to be concerns. As I said, technology has become very cheap. Just think about a television and what you have in your house. 20 years ago, you'd have had to go somewhere else to see these massive screens. You can get that in your porch, on your porch, in your living room. And we as lawyers have to, and me and people who are trained in that area have to be constantly reminding people that not because it's available and it's possible means it's legal, because you may be able to get technology which infringes people's rights. And that's something that we need to be cognizant, I think, as we become in the Caribbean more technologically advanced and as we become, quote unquote, progressive.
Definitely. And especially for all intents and purposes, since Jamaican Eye is not framed in any sort of, legislative document for all intents and purposes, what was your sense about the whole issue of the retention of all of this footage?
The retention of the footage in terms of where it is being kept and where it is being...
And how long?
And for how long. I have that concern. I mean, people who are in law enforcement will be inclined to want to keep it a little bit longer just because, criminal cases, sometimes, for certain things, time does not run against the crown. And so, you want to have that evidence available and you want to have quality evidence available. So I would like a policy to be put in place or some sort of legal framework, which means law or regulations appended to some act. It could be the Evidence Act. It could be some other statute or new statute, which speaks about the retention period, about storage, about how it be processed, and generally give people peace of mind. Because for all we know, Jamaica Eye is a website that tells you how it's used. There's nothing else. There's nothing else. So just like NIDS, I believe that we get caught up in the fact that the executive function of government can move on, we can make these decisions, but our legislative function tends to lag behind, and that's unfortunate.
Yes, this is quite sobering. So I think I'm winding down now. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I would implore your listeners to, look out for the needs decision, the local decision. I believe this is one we should be taking all the way up. And I think it should be. I mean, if people have a concern after the decision is given by the courts, I think it should be. Or the parties can reach some sort of understanding as to what sort of additional safeguards they will put in. But I implore people to listen out. I implore people to look out for the data protection bill, which, just to backtrack, the government was hoping that would have saved the NIDS bill. It does not, because you cannot use a bill which is not in force yet to save an existing law. And one judge actually made that position that, he can't do that. So, I look forward to seeing what the decision will be about, or what decision will be rendered rather, especially because of the right to privacy, which is fairly new now. What does that mean for us in Jamaica? Just to stick a pin, that the right to privacy was not something that was found in the Indian constitution. There was a preliminary decision out of the Indian courts which said that a right to privacy could be implied. And then they gave their major 1,000 odd page decision on that basis. So we already have it in our constitution. I am really, really looking forward to see how we look at it in the Caribbean, because I don't think it's something which, privacy is not something which is within our jurisprudence per se, within our common law jurisprudence, certainly within the English-speaking Caribbean.
Definitely. Yes, the whole issue of NIDS, because I gather that I don't know if it's still on track, but in the newspapers, it was being reported that the government wanted to start a pilot of NIDS, I think, as of January 2019. So I think that as it unfolds, you're probably some more issues are most likely going to come up. And, hopefully those will also get some ventilation and be brought, as appropriate, be brought before the courts for some sort of decision and guidance, because it does look as if the government is keen to have this system implemented, and perhaps ultimately what we all are going to probably have to try to do is to somehow figure out how to navigate it as best as we can and try to manage the risks on as many sides as possible.
Agreed.
All right. So, Grace, thank you so much. I think this was just a lovely introductory discussion. I think probably in a subsequent discussion, we can probably look at other aspects of privacy, probably even with respect to that within the workplace, because certainly with all of the digital media, social media, all of the work that we're doing on computers and online, I think increasingly businesses and organizations have to think about privacy of employee material, client information, as well as just matters relating to the organization itself. So I think that we certainly need to schedule a part 2. Hopefully not too long from now.
Well, I'm always available, and I certainly think when a NIDS decision comes out, it will, have a lot of learning for us, and it'll be a lot more information for discussion. So it's a wide area in terms of privacy in the Caribbean. I think it's a developing area and one that's ready for more discussion.
Excellent. Thanks again.
No problem. Thank you so much.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICT Pulse, or via Twitter @ICT Pulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.